o'clock on Tuesday. Here we are.
All together again.
Well, welcome to our part three of our Empowering Students series. Just a little bit of a refresh. We in part one and part two talked a lot about self-assessment and students taking on responsibility for their learning and how they can know the expectations and where they are in that learning journey. And we've kind of moved on to what we imagine might be the next step and probably the trickiest step, I think, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we want to talk a little bit today about these, I guess we're kind of tossing these terms around. We've talked about student feedback groups. We have some other information about COVID cohorts. So we're kind of using these terms a little bit interchangeably, but one of the things that we've really been talking about is what students do after they've kind of done some self-assessment, and how they can share that information with their peers through these student feedback groups or COVID cohorts or whatever we're calling them, right? And so one of the things that we've really started thinking about is how to build that community with our students when we're feeling maybe a little disconnected from each other and from our students. And what do we do and how can we provide some of these relationships? Because we know as teammates, it takes some time to have a solid enough or a strong enough foundation in your relationship with one another to be very honest with one another and provide productive feedback as opposed to, wow, I really like that. And so we know that now could be the time to start building some of those relationships in hopes that in a month or 2 months that our students can have enough of a solid relationship with one another to maybe start providing some feedback to one another to help that learning progress. If it was only that easy though, right, ladies?
That's so true. So true. I saw a really interesting video that a teacher put out that she had asked her student, it was a home ec teacher, or sorry, home ec is not the right term anymore, foods teacher. And she was giving students a task and they had to cook a meal it was building up to this, but they cooked a meal for their family. And their family was supposed to give them feedback. And one of the girls said, it was so frustrating because all they said was, it's good. It doesn't tell me anything. And that's, I feel like, where we're aiming for with our student feedback groups, like to get beyond the, oh, that was good, and to actually get some meat in the conversations, to actually be able to change processes because of it.
Yeah, and that's really tricky, right? Especially if we're living in virtual worlds or in a hybrid situation, how do we start building some of those relationships? And as we've had these conversations with teachers, a lot of them are saying, like when I put kids into breakout rooms, it's not being productive. And so I guess, some of the things that we brainstormed with them is that we do really feel like those groups should be the same groups that you continue to come back to. And there are some things you have to work through as a group. But on top of that is allowing your students to have some choice in those groups that they're part of. So, and I know I did this in my classroom too, and I know Beth has talked about this as well, is what's one person that you know that you cannot work well with? And what's one student that you feel like would be really exciting to work with? And so that helps them gain some maybe confidence in the groups that they're working in, but really having to model some of those relationships and really be a part of those maybe virtual breakout rooms, moving around group to group, or knowing that you've got two groups that maybe don't work as smoothly as they would like and what you would like, and really kind of bouncing in, just like you would in a classroom, right? Like that, your proximity to those groups is always a little bit closer. So really working on some of that, and then really working in some social emotional stuff too, like just having conversations with one another while you're in breakout rooms really helps build some of those relationships so that you can feel kind of connected to the people in your group.
It seems like one of the things that we have learned is that learning is social. I mean, like we all knew that. But through this quarantine time, I mean, what we're missing is social interaction, both on a personal level and I think on a learning level. And that is part of what this group could also stand in for, a way for students to be socially learning, talking about their learning in a way with their peers that they may not have the opportunity to do in a classroom just because of the way classrooms function sometimes. So there's been some research about the process that teams go through. And I think it's kind of important for us to think about that, because if you put together a student group and you have one task for them and it bombs, my feeling as a teacher is I failed. This isn't going to work. I need to move on. Instead, if we sort of know that groups go through some steps, it can help us to both provide supports, but also to help students know there is another step to go through. So when groups first form, there's some research by a psychologist named Bruce Tuckman, and we'll link this article. We're going to have a blog post from this. The article will be linked. But the first stage is forming. And in that stage, you're all real polite and nice to each other, depending on the age of the kids. I'm just going to say that right up front, because some kids are going to be maybe perhaps not as quite as polite as other kids. But anyway, it's really the getting to know each other. Your feedback is probably going to be pretty surface. It was nice. Here's one suggestion, but really it's pretty surface. Beyond, the next step is he calls it the storming, which is where people start clashing. And this is where teams get very frustrated with their partners. Somebody's always doing, like you hear those kinds of things. They're always doing this. They never do this. As a teacher, you hear those descriptions. Helping teams stick with it through this stage, helping them try to figure out what are expectations for each other. How can we work together? So keeping teams together beyond the storming into the next stage, which is called norming. And this is where you really start helping a team starts to coalesce and figure out, well, this person's going to act this way. How can we start working together to move forward? They're getting more comfortable with each other and perhaps asking for help. This is the stage where people I feel like they start seeing hidden talents in their peers that they may not have noticed in just the classroom discussions, because they're really focused in on each other. One of the real strengths in this norming, and the last stage is called performing. And I'm just going to say this is the nirvana. And if you get a team to a performing, I mean, you as a teacher have earned some pretty high accolades. But at that stage, they're really working on their own. And I do think it happens sometimes, but I'm not sure it happens for everybody. I think a lot of teams stay in the norming. They just kind of are constantly sort of figuring out each other's roles, kind of aligning things. And that's fine. I mean, like as adults, we often are in the norming stages in our groups. Like it's always kind of in flux. But in that norming stage, you've worked together long enough that you can be honest, you can be clear with feedback. I think it's really important for teachers to help students understand the goal of these groups. Like they're really to help your learning. You don't have to be best friends. You don't have to date. You don't have to, all those kinds of things. But you do need to learn how to work together and respect your classmates. And these long-term groups really help with that. I think that respect and understanding. As we're talking more and more about equity and about that feeling in classrooms where we all belong, I think that these groups have the potential to create a framework for that belonging in classrooms.
Because it's really all about the work, right? We need to separate the work from the person. Like we need to look at that. We're not giving feedback that's targeted to a person. We're looking at the work separately, right, Beth?
Absolutely. And that's a pretty high level skill. But I think that if you can help your students get to that place, you have just given a gift to every teacher they're going to interact in the future. So building on that sort of understanding that we're all in this learning together.
I'm so glad you brought up that idea of grace. Usually when you lay out 4 stages, we need to get through all 4 of those stages, right? And to know and think that not all teams are going to get to that 4th stage. Some of them might not even get to the 3rd stage, right? That we give ourselves the grace of knowing that these are kind of just a pattern that has been recognized as teams go through different stages.
And I think it's really important what Mindy said about, as a teacher, I'm going to hang out in groups that are storming more than in any of the other levels, because that storming stage is the potential for real fireworks. And so helping them through that stage, or helping them providing scaffolds for them to work through that stage, is really important.
Well, and just having the conversation and letting students know these are normal stages for you to go in. So it's not that you need to take this personally, or that this group isn't working because of one person. This is a very normal stage that your group might be going through. And I think that's important, even as adults, for us to realize, like, you can go from, I feel like you can go from one stage and circle back to another stage and then circle forward again, and just realizing that it's just the normal dynamics of working with a group.
I think that sometimes the other thing that I think sometimes is really helpful is helping students think about a basketball team or some sort of a sports team. Like, not everybody is the 3-point shooter, but every person on a team is equally important. So helping them figure out what their role is. And as a teacher, I cannot expect every person to be the 3-point shooter. I can't. I can help them figure out what their strengths are and help them learn to their strengths and build to their strengths. But sometimes we want to say every person has to have every job. That just doesn't, that's not necessarily the way, like, that's not reality. And I don't think that's honest for students. If I'm a really shy student, I probably don't want to be the leader. And when my teacher makes me be the leader, it's not going to work well for anybody. So helping that process is really important too.
So I'm going to pick up on your analogy, Beth. So if we got a sports team out there, we give our sports team a play, right, to carry out and carry forward. You can put these teams together. And I mean, I've even seen this with adults. You say, hey, give each other feedback. And we've already pointed this out several times. You get a lot of really open-ended, not effective, and not helpful feedback. And so it's important to give some context or a play for everybody to carry out that's on that team together. And so one of those things that we need to think about is that we need to think about that feedback needs to aim to help improve, the students' work, figure out where your student's at currently, and then be able to offer suggestions to help them move forward. And so we have talked about this, and we think that a great way to do this is to use a feedback protocol. I mean, again, this is a challenging skill for learners at all levels. Okay, and so to use something really simple, and in the blog post that you'll find attached to this, there are 3 different places that have tons of different ideas. You may have already been using or trying some of these things too. Can be as simple as a sentence starter. One of my favorite ones that I like to try out with classes is a 3-sentence sentence starter. I like, I wish, and I wonder. Okay, so I like is just that sentence starter. What do we like about the thing that we're looking at, the model, the context, the text that is there? It gives an opportunity to start that conversation on a positive note. I wish is the second prompt. And so it gives people the opportunity to address maybe a weakness that they see in that, or maybe just a helpful suggestion of something that they didn't think about. And I wonder gives kind of that moment or opportunity to ask a clarifying question. Or is there a piece of the rubric that was presented that the student maybe didn't address? And so how could we help for them to make some more connections to all of that? That simple frame can start to help to establish some momentum from going forward for both the people that are giving the feedback and the people that are receiving the feedback. I think that it's really important to see and think about both sides of that coin, of thinking about what do I do once I now get that? And once you use a feedback protocol, it often already lays it out of where I can go forward.
One of the articles that I read talked about how freeing it is to be able to say, thank you for that feedback, and let it go at that. Because as the author, as the creator, I can still decide if I'm going to use that feedback or not. And I think that it's really important for students to know that, because sometimes people feel like if I give you feedback, you best be using it. That's not what this is about either. This is about a different kind of a learning process.
Exactly. Thinking about it and then seeing how others are seeing your work too. And again, like you said, they can use it or they can just take it in and internalize that and kind of figure out where they need to go next with them.
Well, and I think it's really important too for us to remember that this does not happen overnight. So I know I mentioned that at the beginning, but you really do have to establish some real solid relationships with your students and your students with one another for you to get to this point. So don't imagine that this is going to happen by next week. Imagine getting to a healthier place with your students in these kinds of conversations a month from now, 2 months from now, perhaps, depending on what kind of learning environment you're in as well. In hopes that it'll kind of take some of the responsibility, providing all of the feedback for students and putting some of that responsibility back on them, because teachers are very overwhelmed right now. So we're looking for ways for you to kind of pass off some of that responsibility, and maybe from here on out it is a new practice that you try too, depending on where the world goes from here on out.
Well, and to add to that too, like when students talk to each other, it's like a weird second language that teachers don't always hear, right? Because they can transcribe some things that they may be hearing from the teacher lens. And so it's a really important conversation to be able to fuel, right? And I think one of the biggest things that I personally have learned, and I know that we've all chatted about this too, that during this time when we're not together and we're far, far apart, sometimes we have to communicate more and we have to hear from many other voices to be able to really understand, because you don't have that ability to be maybe proximally close to redirect someone's attention, but maybe if they can hear it through multiple channels and multiple different voices, it can really help them to internalize things.
You know, one of the things that we talk about a lot is students taking responsibility for their learning. And that's sort of like that's what it looks like in classrooms, what you just described, Amber, when they're having learning conversations with other learners without the teacher standing there watching. That's sort of like the hidden sauce that we don't get to see, that we hope happens, but we don't know. So creating these sorts of student feedback teams allows that structure for those moments to happen more frequently. We hope, we think, we know, right?
So we hope that you can join us next week. We're going to add on a digital tool for this in hopes that it will support some of these conversations in an asynchronous environment, and maybe provide a voice for some students who might find it somewhat uncomfortable to give and receive feedback. So we'll be talking a little bit about some of those tools next week and provide a demo to kind of help you work through some of that. Any other words there, ladies?
I think it's perfect. Yep.
All right.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next week.